Over the last few years, several states have taken steps to ban gay conversion therapy for minors, as some argue that practice is tantamount to torture. But in New Hampshire, a pair of bills recently failed in fairly stunning fashion on a pair of tie votes that were broken by the House Speaker. This week, the House is potentially facing a vote to reconsider one of those bills. And here to discuss are Representative Mark Pearson, a Republican from Hampstead, and Representative Ed Butler, a Democrat representative from Hart's Location. Thanks for making the trip down and over, both of you. Thanks. Representative Pearson, you oppose both of these bills. Explain your position.
It was somewhat difficult to oppose because parts of it I would affirm. With friends and family members that this might involve, I certainly don't want anything that's cruel or mean. Some of the testimony we heard in my Health and Human Services Committee indicated that there were places where people were virtually being tortured, and I would certainly be against that. But I found that there were some provisions in the bill that could be read a couple of ways, at least one of which would be, I think, harmful to some people.
Representative Butler, what's the case for voting for these bills?
Conversion therapy is stated in almost through every professional organization to be something that should not be performed. That conversion therapy can harm a child, and we're talking about in this legislation kids 18 and under. It can harm a child, it can lead to poor self-worth, it can hurt family relationships, it can lead to suicide, it can lead to depression, and it doesn't help a child to grow into the person that they will ultimately become. Conversion therapy says that it's not okay to be gay. It's not okay to be lesbian. It's not okay to be a transgender person or questioning your gender identity. And it has been shown repeatedly that this kind of counseling can harm children and can harm families, and it just doesn't make sense for us in New Hampshire.
Representative Pearson, one of your concerns, as you mentioned on the House floor, was that this would ban even talk therapy. You operate a religious counseling business. What would you do if a teen came independently of their parents with supposedly no coercion and asked you to help them not be gay? What would you tell them?
Well, what I have told them is, first of all, I assured them that I care for them, I love them, I affirm them. I've not had people come to me under duress where someone's forcing them. I've had people say to me, I have had feelings for people of the opposite sex, and now I have feelings for somebody of the same sex, and it scares me, and I don't wish that. That's when I need to be able to say that this is a normal developmental thing, and most people, this is what all the studies say, most people eventually move to have feelings for people of the opposite sex once again. And I would like to walk that journey with them. So I would agree with my colleague and my friend that the severe forms, the forms of conversion therapy that are putting people under duress, where there's electric shock, where there's all kinds of things, I would not support those forms of so-called counseling.
Representative Butler, you would argue even that conversation can have a detrimental effect on the child.
How did you know? Absolutely. It is the subtle forms of cultural encouragement or direction that can really be difficult for a child to interpret. So if you say it is likely because the preponderance of people who have same-sex attraction or who are questioning their gender identity eventually will become heterosexual or eventually will be reaffirmed in the gender that they were born in, then that begins to direct the child. What we need to be able to do, and what this legislation would reinforce and encourage, is to say, as you have directed, I'm here to support you, I'm here to affirm you, but not to say, I'm here to help you to grow towards that majority, being attracted to someone of the opposite sex. I'm here to help you to learn and grow into the person that you will become, and we can talk about those feelings. This legislation doesn't prevent any of that discussion, any of that counseling, any of that therapy. What it does work to prevent is saying to a child in any way that the feelings that you're having are not normal, are not natural, and that we will help you to overcome those feelings. That's the negative.
See, I would disagree with some of that, in that if a person comes and says, right now at this moment, I have these same-sex feelings, does that make that person a homosexual, a lesbian? That person in that moment in time is having some feelings that wishes to explore, does not like these feelings. I need to be able to give that evidence. Otherwise, simply to say these feelings at this moment in time is who you are is almost maintaining them in that identity.
And if you say that those feelings are something that you don't want and I can help you to overcome those feelings, you are reaffirming the cultural majority that says being gay and lesbian and transgender is not okay, and that's the problem.
See, I didn't say that.
Yes, you did.
Can I ask one more question? Representative Pearson, do you believe that people are born homosexual or that they can be talked out of it, essentially?
There's a fascinating piece of legislation that was just passed by a state that said, if you're born this way, you are that way. That state was Mississippi. I find that the bulk of mainline counseling, mainline survey studies indicate that gender identity is fairly fluid. And therefore, to say talk one out of being this, I would question if one is this or that. There is a fluidity here in gender self-identification.
Representative Butler.
Indeed, what we heard in testimony day before yesterday on the transgender non-discrimination bill is that gender is fluid and that there are children who are identifying contrary to their birth sex very early in life. And that fluidity has solidified for them into becoming the person who they know they are, as opposed to the person that they were born as in terms of their sexual gender identity at birth. Gender is fluid. And eventually becomes something that the person grows into as the identity of who they know they are. And some of the testimony was just incredible the other day.
I do want to get to one more topic here. One of the arguments against this bill was that this just isn't happening in New Hampshire anymore. There's no more gay conversion therapy. The evidence for that was kind of anecdotal. Can we say for sure, Representative Pearson, that this does not happen in New Hampshire?
I've asked, and this would be anecdotal, I have asked my colleagues, do they know of it? I've asked them to ask their colleagues, do they know of it? And the answer comes back no. One of my colleagues on Health and Human Services Committee of the House called state agencies to say, has there been a complaint filed? And in this climate today, when everybody is now accusing people of having sexually harassed them and everyone's telling their story, the fact that there were no stories that we've heard, no one has come forward and said to us, no one has come to the newspapers and accused a therapist or so-called therapist. If it's happening, we don't know about it, and we've tried to find out about it.
And yet coercion is rarely out in the open, right? It's usually something that's happening quietly.
Sexual harassment is coercion, and we're hearing a lot about it now.
And in the hearings in the Health and Human Services Committee in the House, one of the members stated clearly, the psychiatrist member of the committee, that he knows of colleagues who are performing conversion therapy. Someone else in testimony said that the internet is rife with opportunities to access conversion therapy, and some of them are right across the border in Maine. So I think it's critical that New Hampshire be willing to take a stand and say this kind of therapy, which, just to reinforce, has been said is not something that should be done, and it has been reinforced by the American Psychological Association, the American Psychiatric Association, the American Academy of Pediatrics, the American Medical Association, the National Association of Social Workers, among others, has said that conversion therapy is damaging to children and should not be done.
I hate to interject here. We could talk about this for another hour, but unfortunately we're out of time. Representative Pearson and Representative Butler, we appreciate you coming in to have this discussion today.
Thank you.
Thank you.